The cursor froze on a folder named Just Me, buried deep in the CEO's laptop. Raymond's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the damaged system had already opened it. Photographs filled the screen. Not the polished magazine covers of Vivian Sterling in Sterling Tech's lobby. These were raw. A woman alone in an empty penthouse at 3 in the morning, mascara smudged, staring at nothing. No power suit, no empire. Just loneliness captured in pixels. The office door clicked open. "Am I pretty?" Her voice shattered the silence. Raymond turned to find his boss in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, looking nothing like the billionaire who'd signed his paychecks for 6 years. She wasn't asking about the photos. She was asking him to see what the world never saw, what she'd hidden behind morning briefings and board meetings while he fixed computers in silence, invisible as furniture. 6 years invisible. But that question changed everything. For the first time, Vivian Sterling wasn't looking at an employee. She was looking at the only person who'd accidentally seen the truth she'd buried. And she was terrified. What happens when the most powerful woman asks the question she's never dared speak aloud? Raymond had learned to be invisible during his 6 years at Sterling Tech. He moved through the glass tower like a shadow, fixing servers and resetting passwords, existing in the spaces between importance. The IT department on 19 was his quiet kingdom where people only noticed him when something broke. He preferred it that way because invisible meant safe, meant leaving at 5:15 to pick up his 9-year-old daughter Hazel from after-school care, meant protecting the fragile routine they'd built after losing her mother 4 years ago. The grief had settled into something manageable, like furniture they'd learned to navigate around in the dark. The morning started like every Tuesday. Raymond dropped Hazel at Roosevelt Elementary, watching her backpack bounce as she ran toward her best friend, her laugh carrying across the schoolyard and making his chest tight with relief that she was okay, that they were okay. He stopped at the same coffee cart on 5th Avenue, arrived at Sterling Tech at 7:45, settled into his cubicle that smelled like electrical components and stale coffee. The first tickets came through at 8. Standard stuff until 9:17 when Patricia from the executive suite called with panic in her voice about the CEO's laptop being completely dead, with all the Tokyo presentation files locked inside and a board meeting in 3 hours. Raymond grabbed his toolkit and took the elevator to 32. The executive floor was marble and hushed conversations, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like something Sterling Tech owned. Patricia met him at the glass doors, looking terrified, gestured him toward Vivian Sterling's corner office with instructions to recover whatever he could in 2 hours. The office felt more like a museum than a workspace, all clean lines and abstract art that probably cost more than his annual salary. The laptop sat on the desk like an expensive paperweight, completely unresponsive, encrypted 6 ways from Sunday with security protocols that would trigger a full wipe if he made one wrong move. Raymond connected his diagnostic tools and got to work on the puzzle he actually enjoyed, the way broken systems revealed their secrets if you knew where to look. 20 minutes in, he'd bypassed the first encryption layer. 40 minutes later, he'd restored access to the main directory and located the presentation files, intact and backed up to 3 separate locations. He was transferring them to a secure drive when the system hiccuped, opening a preview pane to check for file corruption, and suddenly he was staring at a folder he definitely wasn't supposed to see. Just Me. 2 words that didn't belong in a corporate directory, innocuous and devastating in their simplicity. The recovery software had flagged it as recently accessed, automatically displaying thumbnails Raymond's brain couldn't process fast enough to unsee. Photographs. Dozens of them. Vivian Sterling in ways the world never saw her, not the commanding CEO from quarterly reports or the Forbes cover, or the woman who'd addressed the entire company last month about innovation with confidence that made investors throw money at her feet. These showed someone else entirely. A woman sitting on the floor of her apartment in an old sweatshirt, legs pulled to chest, looking small and lost. Another at a window at dawn with a coffee cup, staring at nothing with exhaustion that went deeper than late nights at the office. One showed her laughing genuinely at something off-camera, so different from her professional smile it looked like a different person. But the last photo made Raymond freeze completely. A self-portrait taken at 3 in the morning, mascara smudged under her eyes as she sat alone in her penthouse, looking directly at the camera with an expression of such complete devastation. It felt like witnessing something sacred and private and utterly heartbreaking. The office door clicked open behind him. Raymond didn't turn immediately, paralyzed by the sudden knowledge that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross, seen something he had no right to see, violated a privacy that went far beyond corporate policy. He could feel her presence change the air in the room, could imagine her taking in the scene with his back to her, and her private folder open on the screen, and her loneliness exposed like an open wound. The silence stretched unbearably until he finally turned with an apology already forming in his throat, but the words died when he saw her face. Vivian Sterling stood in the doorway in a charcoal suit that probably cost 3 months of his salary, her dark hair pulled back severely, looking every inch the CEO except her arms were wrapped around herself in a gesture that looked less like confidence and more like someone trying to hold themselves together. She wasn't angry. She wasn't commanding him to leave or threatening to call security. She just looked at him with vulnerability so raw it made his chest ache, because he recognized it from his own mirror in the months after his wife died when he'd wondered if he was enough to keep Hazel's world from falling apart. The question came out barely above a whisper, but it shattered everything between them like breaking glass. "Am I pretty?" Raymond opened his mouth, closed it, tried to process what was happening. This was Vivian Sterling, who'd built Sterling Tech from a garage startup to a multinational corporation before turning 35, who negotiated billion-dollar deals before lunch, who had a reputation for being brilliant and ruthless and completely unshakable. And she was asking him, the IT guy whose name she'd probably never learned, if she was pretty. Raymond stood slowly, carefully, like approaching something fragile. The photos were still visible on the screen behind him, evidence of the truth she'd hidden from everyone. He thought about lying, about giving her a polite corporate answer that would let them both pretend this hadn't happened, but something in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't asking as a CEO. She was asking as a woman who'd taken those photos at 3 in the morning because she needed proof that she existed beyond the empire she'd built, beyond the constant performance of competence. She was asking because she'd just been caught being human, and she was terrified the answer was no. "Yes," Raymond said quietly, meaning it completely. "The photos aren't what I expected to find, but yeah, you look more real in them than any magazine cover I've ever seen." Vivian's breath caught, just slightly, a crack in the careful composure she wore like armor. For a moment, neither of them moved, suspended in the intimacy of unexpected honesty. Then she straightened, and he watched her pull the CEO mask back into place, watched the vulnerability disappear behind practiced professionalism. "The presentation files," she said, her voice steadier now but still holding the faintest tremor. "Did you recover them?" Raymond nodded, gestured to the secure drive on her desk, confirmed the system would boot normally now and he'd adjusted security protocols so this wouldn't happen again. "Thank you," she said formally, picking up the drive with hands that didn't quite shake but came close. "I appreciate your discretion about what you saw." It was a dismissal, professional and final. Raymond should have left immediately, should have grabbed his toolkit and returned to his cubicle on 19, and forgotten this entire interaction ever happened. But something made him pause at the door, some instinct he couldn't name. "Miss Sterling," he said without quite looking at her. "I don't know if it means anything, but those photos look like someone trying really hard to remember who they are. That's not something to be ashamed of." He left before she could respond, before he could see whether his words landed or just made everything worse, his heart hammering as the elevator descended and reality reasserted itself with each passing floor. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tickets that felt meaningless after that moment of raw honesty. Raymond fixed servers and replaced monitors, and walked people through password resets they could have done themselves, all while his mind kept circling back to Vivian Sterling's question and the loneliness captured in those photographs. He picked up Hazel at 5:15, listened to her chatter about the upcoming science museum field trip, made spaghetti for dinner while she did homework at their kitchen table. This was his real life, the routine that mattered, the small, important things that kept him grounded. That strange moment in the executive suite should have faded into background noise, but it didn't. It stayed with him through dinner, through helping with math homework, through reading 2 chapters of the dragon book Hazel was obsessed with, through tucking her into bed and watching her fall asleep with an expression of peace that made his heart hurt because she was so young and had already lost so much. Raymond sat in his living room afterward, laptop open to work emails he didn't care about, unable to stop thinking about those photographs. About loneliness captured in pixels. About a woman who had everything the world said mattered, but still took pictures of herself at 3 in the morning like she was trying to prove she existed. He understood it more than he wanted to admit because after Sarah died, he'd gone through months of feeling invisible even to himself, going through motions without feeling present, existing for Hazel because she needed him but not really living. The grief had been a kind of loneliness that made him understand what it meant to be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone. He'd pulled through eventually, built this small life that worked, but he remembered what it felt like to wonder if anyone really saw you beneath the performance. His phone buzzed at 10:37 with a message from an unknown number. "This is Vivian Sterling. Patricia gave me your contact information. The laptop is functioning perfectly. Thank you for your work today." Raymond stared at the message, professional and distant, exactly what he'd expected. He should have responded with something equally professional and let it end there. But his fingers moved before his brain caught up, typing words he'd probably regret. "You're welcome, and for what it's worth, the answer to your question hasn't changed." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then immediately wondered if he'd just done something incredibly stupid that could cost him his job or at minimum make his work life unbearable. The response came 2 minutes later, making his heart skip. "Would you be available to check my home system this weekend? I've been having connectivity issues." Raymond read the message 3 times, looking for subtext he wasn't sure was there. This could be legitimate, since executives often had him do house calls for their home office setups. Or this could be something else, an extension of a conversation that had barely started, a question neither of them knew how to ask directly. He thought about Hazel, about the careful boundaries he'd built around their life, about not complicating things unnecessarily. Then he thought about Vivian Sterling asking if she was pretty in a voice that sounded like she genuinely didn't know the answer, and typed back before he could overthink it. "Saturday afternoon works. Send me the address." Saturday arrived, wrapped in October sunshine and the smell of fallen leaves. Raymond made pancakes for Hazel's breakfast, dropped her at her friend Zoe's house for a playdate that had been planned for weeks, then drove to the address Vivian had sent. The Upper East Side building had the kind of lobby where the doorman looked like security, and the elevator required a key card for the penthouse. Raymond rode up alone, watching the numbers climb, trying to remember this was just a work call. Professional and routine, nothing to be nervous about. The elevator opened directly into her apartment because apparently when you were rich enough, you didn't need hallways. Vivian was waiting, and for a moment Raymond almost didn't recognize her without the armor of her power suits. She wore jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair down around her shoulders, minimal makeup making her look younger and more approachable than he'd ever seen her. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing him inside with genuine gratitude in her voice. "I know this is your weekend. I appreciate you making time." The apartment was enormous, all floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture that looked expensive and uncomfortable, but it was also strangely impersonal, like a hotel room someone had lived in for years without ever quite moving in. No photographs on the walls, no personal touches, just clean lines and neutral colors and the sense of a space that was inhabited but never truly felt like home. It was the loneliest beautiful place Raymond had ever seen. Vivian led him to a home office that looked more lived in than the rest of the apartment, with actual books on the shelves and papers scattered across the desk, and a coffee cup with lipstick on the rim suggesting recent occupation. "The connectivity drops randomly," she explained, with professional distance firmly back in place. Usually during video calls, which is problematic. Raymond nodded, set up his laptop, started running diagnostics while she stood by the window looking out at the city. The issue was straightforward: interference from neighboring networks, easily fixed with a channel change and configuration adjustments. 20 minutes, tops. He could have this done and be back in Queens before Hazel's playdate ended. But as he worked, the silence between them felt weighted with everything they weren't saying. Raymond finished the diagnostics, tested the connection, confirmed it was stable and optimized. That should do it, he said, starting to pack up his equipment. The interference was causing packet loss. Should be solid now. He was ready to leave, to let this strange chapter close and go back to being invisible, when Vivian spoke without turning from the window. "I lied about the connectivity issue," she said quietly. "I mean, there is an issue, but that's not why I asked you here." Raymond froze, laptop half closed, heart suddenly racing. "I haven't stopped thinking about what you said. About the photos. About remembering who you are." She finally turned to face him, and her expression was open in a way that clearly terrified her. "I don't have friends, Raymond. I have employees and investors and board members and people who want things from me. I haven't had a real conversation with another human being in longer than I can remember." Raymond set his laptop down carefully, this conversation careening into territory he wasn't prepared for, but turning away felt impossible. "I think I understand," he said slowly. "My wife died 4 years ago. Car accident, sudden. 1 minute we were planning Hazel's 6th birthday, and the next I was a single parent trying to figure out how to keep breathing. For a long time after, I felt like I was performing being alive for her benefit, going through motions while everyone around me saw the grieving widower or the dedicated dad or whatever version they needed, but nobody actually saw me. I know what it's like to wonder if the real you even exists anymore." Vivian's eyes widened with recognition, something shifting in her expression. "I'm sorry," she said softly, genuinely. "That must have been devastating." "It was. Still is. Some days. But Hazel's amazing, and we've built something good together. Small, but good." He paused, choosing words carefully. "I think that's what struck me about your photos. They looked like someone trying to build something real in the middle of all the performance. That takes courage." Vivian laughed, but it was brittle, almost breaking. "Courage. Is that what you call taking selfies at 3 a.m. because you're so lonely you need proof you're still human?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned back to the window like she couldn't face him while admitting this fundamental truth about herself. "I inherited this company from my father, built it into something bigger, and everyone tells me how impressive that is, how successful. But success is just another kind of loneliness when you can't turn it off, when every relationship is strategic, when you can't remember the last time someone asked how you were and actually wanted an honest answer." Raymond moved to the window beside her, but not too close, respecting the space she needed while offering proximity as comfort. The city stretched out below them, millions of people living millions of separate lives, and he thought about his tiny apartment in Queens and Saturday morning pancakes with Hazel, and how none of it looked impressive from up here, but it was the only thing that actually mattered. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "You asked me if you were pretty, but I think that wasn't really the question. I think you were asking if you're real, if the person underneath all of this counts. And the answer is yes. That woman in those photos is more real than any corporate headshot. She's lonely and exhausted and human, and that's not a weakness. That's just what it looks like when you stop performing for 5 minutes." Vivian was crying now, quietly, tears sliding down her cheeks while she kept her gaze fixed on the city below them. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered with such profound vulnerability it made Raymond's chest ache. "The performing. I've been doing it so long I don't remember what else looks like." He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort beyond words, but wasn't sure if touch would help or hurt, so he kept his hands at his sides and offered the only thing he knew how to give. "Then maybe start small," Raymond said gently. I'm not a therapist or a life coach or whatever executives use, but I know that after Sarah died, I had to rebuild from tiny things, making Hazel laugh, actually tasting my coffee instead of just drinking it, noticing the weather, little moments of being present instead of going through motions. You don't have to figure out your whole life at once. You just have to find one real thing and hold on to it. Vivian finally looked at him, her professional mask completely gone, just a woman standing in her expensive prison asking for something she didn't know how to name. "What if I don't know how?" she asked, with the uncertainty of someone who'd spent years being certain about everything. Raymond smiled, sad and understanding and full of hard-won wisdom. "Then you practice. You mess up. You keep trying, same as everyone else." They stood there in her office overlooking the city, two lonely people who'd accidentally found each other in the space between their carefully constructed lives. And for the first time in 6 years of working at Sterling Tech, Raymond felt like he wasn't invisible at all. The following Monday, Raymond expected things to return to normal, expected the strange intimacy of Saturday afternoon to evaporate in the fluorescent office lighting and be forgotten or ignored or reduced to one of those weird moments people pretended never happened. But at 11:15, his desk phone rang with Patricia's professional voice, requesting his assistance with Miss Sterling's laptop on 32, when convenient. When he arrived, Vivian's office door was open, and she sat at her desk, looking every inch the CEO again. But when she glanced up and saw him, something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but a softening that felt significant. "Thank you for coming," she said, gesturing to the laptop. "The system's running slowly. I thought you might check it." Raymond approached, noticed immediately that the laptop was running perfectly fine. The slow performance, a complete fiction. Vivian saw him notice, and this time she did smile, small and almost shy in a way that didn't match her reputation at all. "I'm practicing," she said quietly enough that only he could hear. "Small, real things. Asking for help when I don't need it because I actually just want someone to talk to. Is that allowed?" Raymond felt something warm unfold in his chest, understanding that this was dangerous territory with all its complications of power dynamics and workplace relationships and the massive gap between her world and his. But he thought about her question in that doorway, about loneliness captured in pixels, about the courage it took to admit you were drowning when everyone thought you were swimming. "Yeah," he said, pulling up a chair. "That's allowed." They talked for 30 minutes about nothing particularly important, safe topics that felt revolutionary in their normalcy. She asked about Hazel with genuine interest, seemed to genuinely care about the details of elementary school drama and upcoming field trips. He asked about the Tokyo deal. Learned the board meeting had gone well, but negotiating across time zones was exhausting in ways that went beyond just staying awake. It was surface level and careful but real in a way their previous interactions never had been. And when Raymond left, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. Over the following weeks, it became a pattern. Small moments stolen from the performance of their professional lives, where Vivian would call with minor technical issues that rarely existed, and Raymond would arrive to fix imaginary problems while they talked about real things. She started asking questions that went deeper than small talk, wanting to know what it was like raising a daughter alone, how he managed the guilt when he couldn't be everything she needed, whether he ever resented the life he'd ended up with instead of the one he'd planned. He answered honestly, surprising himself with how much he shared, and slowly, carefully, she started sharing back. About the pressure of living up to her father's legacy, about investor calls that felt like performing in a play she'd never auditioned for, about the exhaustion of being brilliant and ruthless, and never allowed to be uncertain or afraid or simply tired. They were careful not to cross certain lines, both aware this wasn't dating or romance but something else. Two people creating space to be human with each other without pretense or performance. Then one Thursday morning, Raymond got the call every parent fears. The school nurse, apologetic and concerned, saying Hazel had a fever of 103 and was asking for him and needed to be picked up immediately. He was in the middle of a server migration on 15, the kind of thing that couldn't be paused without risking significant data loss. And his mind raced through options while his heart hammered with worry. He could call his sister, but she was 3,000 miles away in Portland. His neighbor sometimes helped in emergencies but was visiting her son in California. He was about to abandon the server migration and deal with the consequences when his phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "Patricia mentioned you got an emergency call. Do you need help?" Raymond stared at the message, conflicted because this was crossing a different kind of line, letting his personal life bleed into her world in ways that felt too vulnerable and too real. But Hazel was waiting, probably scared and definitely feeling awful, and he was 20 minutes away in traffic that could easily become 40. He texted back quickly. "My daughter's sick at school. I need to pick her up, but I'm in the middle of something critical. I'll figure it out." The response came immediately, no hesitation. "What school? I can get her." This was too much, too far beyond appropriate, asking his CEO to do a personal favor that went miles past any reasonable boundary. But Hazel was waiting, and Raymond typed the school address before he could overthink it. Added instructions about her dinosaur backpack and shyness with strangers, and that she'd be okay if Vivian said her dad had sent her. An hour later, his phone buzzed with a photo that made his heart stop. Vivian's text was brief. "We're at your apartment. She showed me where you keep the spare key. Fever's down to 101. We're watching something called Dragon Riders. She says you're doing the voices wrong." The image showed Hazel curled on their worn couch, wrapped in her favorite blanket, looking small and feverish but content, and Vivian Sterling still in her work clothes but somehow looking perfectly natural in his modest living room, sitting beside his daughter with a gentleness he'd never witnessed in any board meeting. The image didn't compute, his worlds colliding in ways he'd carefully kept separate. But there was the proof that sometimes life didn't care about the boundaries you built so carefully. Raymond finished the server migration, documented everything for his team, and left work 2 hours early for the first time in 6 years, his mind racing the entire subway ride home with a mixture of gratitude and confusion, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. When he opened his apartment door, the scene was so unexpectedly domestic it made his chest ache with emotions he'd thought were safely buried. Vivian had clearly made tea, 2 cups on the coffee table alongside Hazel's favorite juice box, and his daughter was asleep now with fever-flushed cheeks looking peaceful. Vivian sat on the other end of the couch, reading something on her phone, and when she looked up as he entered, her expression was equal parts exhausted and content. Like this had somehow been exactly what she needed too. "She's okay," Vivian said quietly, immediately understanding that his first concern would be his daughter's well-being. Fever broke about 30 minutes ago. She had some crackers and mostly just wanted to sleep. Raymond moved to Hazel, pressed his hand to her forehead, felt the heat confirming she was still sick but no longer burning up dangerously. Relief flooded through him so strongly his knees went weak, and he had to sit on the coffee table for a moment. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling completely inadequate for what she'd done. "You didn't have to do this." Vivian stood, gathering her jacket with careful movements that suggested she didn't want to wake Hazel. "I wanted to. She's a great kid, Raymond. She told me about the dragon book, about how you do all the voices, about her mom." Her voice softened on that last word with genuine compassion. Raymond felt unexpected tears prick his eyes, because of course Hazel had talked about Sarah, his daughter who kept her mother's memory alive in the most natural ways. "Stay for dinner," he said impulsively, the words out before he could consider whether they were appropriate. "It's just going to be soup and grilled cheese. Nothing fancy, but it's the least I can do." Vivian hesitated, and he could see her weighing boundaries, calculating appropriateness, starting to build walls back up out of habit. "Please," he added quietly, and something in his voice must have convinced her because she nodded and set her jacket back down and settled onto the couch, like maybe she'd been hoping he'd ask. Raymond made his grandmother's tomato soup recipe and grilled cheese sandwiches that were slightly burned because he was distracted by Vivian sitting at his kitchen table looking simultaneously out of place and perfectly right. They ate while Hazel dozed on the couch, and their conversation was different here in his space, surrounded by evidence of his real life. Photos of Hazel on the fridge, Sarah's cookbook on the counter with notes in the margins. The small, cluttered reality of a life lived for someone else's happiness. Vivian noticed everything, asked about things in ways that felt genuine rather than polite, wanted to know when Sarah wrote those notes, and what Hazel wanted to be when she grew up, and how he managed to make their apartment feel like a home when her penthouse just felt like expensive emptiness. He answered honestly, and somewhere in the middle of explaining how he and Hazel picked out new curtains together last spring, Raymond realized they'd crossed into territory neither of them could back away from anymore. This wasn't boss and employee. This was something else. Something fragile and real and terrifying in its potential to hurt them both. Hazel woke around 7, still groggy but better, and spotted Vivian at the table with a sleepy smile. "You stayed," she said, like this was normal, like having her dad's CEO eating soup in their kitchen was just another Thursday. They talked for a few minutes, Hazel's child logic accepting Vivian's presence without question, asking if she'd read the Dragon book yet, and insisting she should because it was the best book ever written, and Raymond watched them interact with his heart, doing complicated things in his chest. When Vivian finally left around 8, she paused at the door with an expression that held more than words could express. "Thank you for dinner," she said formally, but her eyes held something warmer and more vulnerable. "Anytime," Raymond replied, meaning it completely. After she left, he helped Hazel back to bed, listened to her chatter about how nice Miss Sterling was and whether she'd come visit again, told his daughter maybe, but she was very busy, tried to ignore Hazel's unnerving observation that Vivian didn't look busy when she was here. She looked happy. Raymond cleaned up the kitchen and tried not to think about how right it had felt to have someone else at his table, someone who looked at his small life and saw something worth staying for. The next morning, Raymond found an envelope under his apartment door containing a note in elegant handwriting. "Thank you for letting me be part of something real yesterday. I haven't felt that grounded in years. P.S. I'm reading the Dragon book. Hazel's right. It's excellent. P.P.S. Your voices really are terrible." Raymond read it 3 times, smiling despite himself, and tucked it into his wallet like a secret he wasn't ready to examine too closely. At work that day, Vivian didn't call with fake laptop problems, maintained professional distance in meetings, gave no indication she'd spent the previous evening in his apartment making tea for his sick daughter. But at 4:30, his phone buzzed with a simple text asking if Hazel was feeling better, and they texted sporadically through the evening about the Dragon book and his recommendations for the next series, casual and easy, and dangerously normal. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them that everyone around them pretended not to notice but absolutely did. Vivian stopped inventing technical problems and started just asking if Raymond wanted to have lunch, and they'd eat in her office or sometimes at a quiet cafe 3 blocks from Sterling Tech, where nobody from the company went. They talked about real things, sharing the small vulnerabilities that came from trusting someone to handle them carefully. She told him about growing up as her father's successor, about the pressure of knowing she was born to fulfill someone else's vision rather than discover her own. He told her about his early marriage to Sarah, about college sweethearts who'd built a life from nothing and how losing her had felt like losing his future tense, like every plan had died with her. But they were also careful, hyper-aware of boundaries and consequences. No touching beyond accidental brushes that sent electricity through both of them. No acknowledgement that this might be heading somewhere neither could name. They existed in a careful space of emotional intimacy without physical expression, both too aware of what crossing that final line would mean. Then one Friday evening, Vivian asked the question that changed everything, her voice uncertain in a way he'd rarely heard. "Would you and Hazel want to come to the park tomorrow? I know this is weird, but I haven't been to a park in years." And she mentioned loving the one near her school, and I thought maybe we could just be normal people for an afternoon. Raymond should have said no, should have maintained boundaries and protected Hazel from getting attached to someone who might not stay and kept his own feelings carefully contained in the safe space he'd built. But he thought about Vivian reading Dragon books and making tea for his sick daughter, and asking if she was pretty in a voice that still haunted him months later. "Yeah," he said, meaning it despite the fear. "We'd like that." Saturday afternoon found them at Riverside Park with October sunshine turning leaves gold. Hazel running ahead to the playground while Raymond and Vivian walked slowly behind. They looked like a family. He knew they looked like a family to anyone watching, and the thought terrified him because it felt too good and too easy and too much like something he'd stopped letting himself want. Hazel was fearless on the playground equipment, climbing structures Raymond thought were too high while he hovered nearby, trying not to be overprotective in the way Sarah had always gently teased him about. Vivian watched with something like wonder in her expression. "She's remarkable," she said quietly. "The way she just throws herself at life without hesitation." Raymond nodded, throat tight. "She gets that from her mom. Sarah was like that, confident and fearless. I worry I'm too cautious for her sometimes, that I'm holding her back because I'm scared of losing her too." They sat on a bench while Hazel played, and Vivian asked questions about Sarah that felt respectful rather than intrusive, wanting to know what she'd been like and how they'd met and whether it was hard to talk about her now. Raymond found himself sharing memories he usually kept private about Sarah's terrible sense of direction and incredible optimism and the way she'd made their tiny apartment feel like the center of the universe through sheer force of belief in their life together. "She sounds amazing," Vivian said with genuine admiration. "I would have liked to meet her." The simple honesty of it made Raymond smile despite the ache. She would have liked you. She had strong opinions about people, could read them instantly, and she'd have seen past the CEO thing to who you actually are. Vivian was quiet for a moment before asking softly, almost afraid of the answer, "Who am I actually?" It wasn't rhetorical. She genuinely wanted him to tell her, like she'd lost track somewhere along the way of building her empire. Raymond thought about those photographs at 3 a.m., about her crying in her penthouse, about the way she'd sat on his couch reading to his sick daughter like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're someone who's been performing so long you forgot it was supposed to be temporary," he said carefully, choosing each word with intention. "Someone brilliant and successful and lonely as hell. Someone brave enough to admit it. Someone who makes my daughter laugh and reads dragon books and asks hard questions. You're all of it, Vivian. The CEO and the woman in those photos. That's who you actually are." Before she could respond, Hazel ran over demanding ice cream from the cart near the playground entrance, and Raymond started to say they should head home soon, but Vivian stood immediately, declared ice cream sounded perfect, insisted it was her treat with a smile that transformed her face. They walked to the cart together with Hazel between them, and when his daughter grabbed both their hands, Raymond's heart did something complicated and wonderful and terrifying. This was too much, too fast, too dangerous for everyone involved. But Hazel was seriously debating between chocolate and strawberry, and Vivian was listening, like this 9-year-old's ice cream preference was the most important decision in the world. They found a bench overlooking the Hudson River, eating ice cream while boats passed in the distance, and Hazel told Vivian about her school's upcoming fall festival and the costume she wanted to make, and how her dad was terrible at sewing but tried really hard anyway, and Vivian offered to help with an eagerness that suggested she was as surprised by the offer as anyone. The afternoon stretched into evening with October air turning cool and city lights beginning to sparkle across the river. Hazel eventually tired, leaning against Raymond's shoulder with the comfortable weight of a child who felt completely safe. And Vivian sat on his other side close enough that their shoulders almost touched, the silence between them feeling full rather than empty. Then Hazel asked with devastating child directness, "Why don't you smile more?" She was looking at Vivian with curious eyes, no judgment, just genuine question. "You're really nice, but you look sad a lot." Raymond started to redirect, to save Vivian from having to answer, but she spoke first with brutal honesty. "I think I forgot how. I've been pretending to smile for work for so long that real smiling became hard. But being here with you two, I think I'm remembering." Hazel considered this with the seriousness of someone much older than 9. "My mom died," she said matter-of-factly. And for a long time, Dad forgot how to smile, too. But then he started doing it again. Real ones, not pretend ones. Maybe you just need practice. Vivian's eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, her throat working as she tried to maintain composure. Maybe you're right, she managed. She looked at Raymond over Hazel's head, and in her eyes he saw everything they hadn't said. Gratitude and longing and fear and hope, all mixed together in an expression so vulnerable it made his chest ache. "Thank you for today," she said quietly, "for letting me be part of this." Raymond wanted to tell her she was already part of it, that somewhere between that first question and this moment she'd become woven into the fabric of their lives. But the words felt too big. That night, after Hazel was in bed, still chattering about how fun the park had been, Raymond's phone buzzed with a text from Vivian that made his world tilt. "I can't remember the last time I laughed like that. Really laughed. The kind that makes your stomach hurt. Thank you for seeing me. For letting me be human for an afternoon. For not making me be the CEO version." He stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to find words adequate for what he felt. Finally, he typed carefully, "You don't have to thank me for that. You're allowed to just be yourself. And for what it's worth, I like this version of you better than the CEO one. Both are real, but this one is happier." The response came quickly, direct and terrifying and perfect. "I think I'm falling for you." Is that completely inappropriate and terrifying? Raymond's heart stopped, started again, raced ahead of his thoughts. This was the line they'd been carefully dancing around for weeks. Crossing it meant consequences neither could predict. He thought about Hazel getting attached, about workplace complications, about all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Then he thought about Vivian crying in her penthouse at 3 a.m. and asking if she was pretty and reading dragon books and making his daughter laugh with genuine joy. He typed back with hands that trembled slightly. Completely inappropriate. Absolutely terrifying. And I feel the same way. The following months were a lesson in building a life from small moments rather than grand gestures. Vivian became a regular presence in their routine, helping with Hazel's fall festival costume, attending the festival itself, standing with Raymond watching their daughter run through the school gymnasium with her friends, their fingers brushing and neither pulling away. They navigated workplace complications by being honest with HR about their relationship, endured whispered speculation from colleagues but found most people professional enough to keep opinions private. Vivian was better at her job now, more focused and present, making decisions with clarity that came from having something beyond work to care about. By spring, she'd effectively moved into Raymond's apartment in Queens, her Manhattan penthouse maintained but rarely used, claiming she liked the neighborhood better but really just wanting somewhere that felt like home. They had fights about whose turn to do dishes and whether Hazel could have a second dessert. They had serious conversations about boundaries with Hazel, about not trying to replace Sarah but finding their own dynamic that honored the past while building something new. They had moments of doubt when Vivian got overwhelmed by board meetings or Raymond got scared about the future or Hazel missed her mom with intensity that reminded them grief didn't disappear just because new love appeared. But they also had Saturday morning pancakes and dragon book marathons and park afternoons and quiet evenings where the domesticity still sometimes stunned Raymond with its simple beauty, 3 people learning to be present for each other. One Saturday morning in May, Raymond woke to find Vivian and Hazel making breakfast together in the kitchen, both wearing ridiculous aprons Hazel had insisted on buying, laughing about something with flour somehow everywhere. Sunlight through the window painted them both gold, and Vivian looked up and saw him watching from the doorway and smiled. Not the CEO smile, not careful or professional, just genuine happiness, unguarded and real. Raymond thought about that first question months ago, about her asking if she was pretty while terrified in her office doorway, about how he'd told her yes based on photographs and potential. Now he knew the answer with absolute certainty that went beyond appearance into something far more profound. She was beautiful in ways that actually mattered. In the patience she showed Hazel with difficult homework, in the way she'd learned to make tea exactly how he liked it, in her determination to improve at pancakes despite repeated failures, In the vulnerability she showed when work overwhelmed her and she needed reassurance, she didn't have to be perfect. In quiet moments when she'd hold his hand and whisper she'd never felt so seen, so known, so completely herself with anyone. Beauty wasn't magazine covers or power suits or boardroom confidence. Beauty was this: Saturday morning flower fights and genuine laughter, and choosing to be present in a life built from ordinary moments that added up to everything. Raymond moved into the kitchen, wrapped his arms around her from behind, kissed the top of her head while breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with flour. "Good morning," he murmured against her hair. Vivian leaned back into him, relaxed in a way she never was anywhere else, her body fitting against his like they'd been designed for exactly this. "Dad, you have to help us," Hazel announced with dramatic urgency. "We're making special pancakes, but they keep breaking, and Vivian says you're the pancake expert, even though your voices are terrible." Raymond laughed, looked at the stove, and saw evidence of several pancake casualties scattered across the counter. "Maybe I should take over before you burn down the kitchen," he suggested. But Vivian just smiled and said she was practicing small, real things. Exactly what he'd told her to do that first afternoon in her penthouse. They ate breakfast together. 3 people crowded around the small kitchen table that had once felt empty even with 2 people, and Hazel chattered about plans involving Zoe and the park and an elaborate dragon game they'd invented. Vivian listened with genuine interest, asking questions that made Hazel feel heard and valued. And Raymond watched them interact, feeling something settle deep in his chest like a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place. This was his family now, not replacing what he'd lost, but building something new from broken pieces of grief and loneliness. It wasn't perfect because nothing ever was. Vivian still worked too much sometimes. Hazel still had hard days missing Sarah intensely. Raymond still woke some mornings with anxiety about whether he was doing enough. But they were doing it together, and that made all the difference. After breakfast, Vivian helped Hazel get ready for her playdate, the 2 of them disappearing into Hazel's room to find the right outfit for dragon games. With negotiations Raymond could hear through the door, making him smile. He cleaned up the kitchen, listening to their laughter, thinking about that first afternoon when Vivian had asked if she was pretty and he'd realized she was asking the wrong question entirely. The right question wasn't about appearance or worth or whether anyone would see her without armor. The right question was whether she could let herself be seen, whether she could risk vulnerability, whether she could stop performing long enough to discover who she actually was beneath expectations and pressure and loneliness that had nearly consumed her. She'd been brave enough to ask. He'd been brave enough to answer honestly. And somehow in the space between that question and this moment, they'd built something real and lasting and worth every risk they'd taken. Vivian emerged from Hazel's room looking triumphant, announced the green shirt was essential for dragon games, though she didn't ask why because dragon game logic was apparently complex. They dropped Hazel at Zoe's house, waited until she was safely inside and distracted by her friend's new hamster before driving back home. The apartment felt quiet, without Hazel's constant energy, intimate in a different way that made Raymond's pulse quicken as Vivian kicked off her shoes and curled up on the couch, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What?" he asked, settling beside her and immediately getting pulled into her orbit, their bodies finding each other like magnets. She took his hand, laced their fingers together with deliberate care. "I was just thinking about how 6 months ago I was taking pictures of myself at 3 in the morning, trying to remember what it felt like to be human. And now I'm here, in your apartment, making pancakes with your daughter, part of something real. It's surreal sometimes." Raymond squeezed her hand gently. "Good, surreal, or bad, surreal?" Vivian smiled, that genuine smile that still took his breath away every single time. "The best kind of surreal. The kind where I wake up and can't believe this is my life now. Where I look forward to coming home because home actually means something beyond just where I sleep. Where I'm not performing for anyone, including myself. I'm happy, Raymond. Really, truly happy. I didn't think I was capable of that anymore." He pulled her closer, felt her settle against his chest with a sigh that released tension he hadn't realized she'd been carrying. You did the hard part, he said quietly into her hair. You asked the question. You let yourself be seen. That took more courage than anything else. They sat in comfortable silence while sunlight moved across the floor, and the city hummed outside with its usual chaos. But here in this small apartment, everything was still and perfect and exactly right. Raymond thought about Sarah sometimes, about the life they'd planned that ended too soon, and he'd loved her completely and grieved her thoroughly and would carry her memory forever. But he'd also learned hearts were bigger than he'd thought, capable of holding multiple truths simultaneously. He could honor what he'd lost while embracing what he'd found. Could be a widower, and a partner, and a father, all at once. Eventually, Vivian pulled back enough to look at him, her eyes holding a question that was both terrifying and hopeful. "Where is this going?" she asked, with the directness he'd come to love. "I mean, I know we're together. I know Hazel's part of this. I know I'm happier than I've been in years. But long-term, what does this look like? Because I need to know if we're building towards something or if this is just good for now." Raymond's heart rate picked up because this was the conversation they'd been dancing around, both afraid to push too hard or want too much. "What do you want it to look like?" he asked carefully, needing to know her answer first. Vivian bit her lip, vulnerable in a way that made her look younger. "I want everything," she admitted in a rush, like the words had been building pressure for months. "I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to be there for Hazel's school stuff and hard days and celebrations. I want to build a life that's ours, not just borrowed moments between responsibility. I want to be part of this family officially, not just the woman dating Hazel's dad. But I'm terrified to ask for that because what if it's too much, too fast, or you're not ready, or Hazel's not ready, or I'm asking for more than I deserve after being alone so long?" Raymond cupped her face in his hands, made sure she was looking directly at him. "You deserve everything, Vivian, and I want to give it to you. I want you here permanently. I want to build a life together that's real and messy and completely ours." The relief that flooded her face was beautiful to witness. "Really?" she whispered, like she couldn't quite believe it. "Even with all my baggage and workaholic tendencies, and the fact that I still don't know how to be a parental figure?" Raymond smiled with all the certainty he felt. "Especially with all that. You're learning, we're all learning. That's what families do." He paused, considering carefully. "I should talk to Hazel first, though. Make sure she's comfortable with this being permanent. She loves you, but this is her home too, and she gets a say." Vivian nodded immediately with understanding that only made him love her more. "Of course, whatever she needs. I never want to push into spaces I'm not wanted." That evening he had the conversation with Hazel, asking how she'd feel if Vivian lived with them full-time, and his daughter's response was pure Hazel logic about whether Vivian would still help with homework and make terrible pancakes, followed by the devastating question of whether Vivian made him really happy. And when he said yes, Hazel simply said, then it was okay because he deserved to be happy, and Mom would want that too. Raymond told Vivian later, and she cried with pure relief and gratitude, promising she'd always try and always show up and always care even when she messed up. The transition happened gradually over summer, Vivian moving her belongings into their apartment that became truly theirs, navigating logistics of combining lives that had been separate. They argued about storage space and whose books went where. They laughed at the absurdity of a billionaire CEO sharing a closet half the size of her old bathroom. They cried together, sorting through some of Sarah's things, Vivian understanding grief didn't have expiration dates and honoring the past was part of building the future. They celebrated small victories like successful pancakes and Hazel's easy use of Vivian's first name, and Raymond realizing he could talk about Sarah without guilt about being happy with someone new. By the time fall arrived again, exactly 1 year after that first afternoon, they'd built something permanent and real and theirs. The apartment was full of evidence of their blended life. Vivian's business books beside Raymond's technical manuals, Hazel's artwork covering the fridge alongside photos of all three of them, coffee cups, each of them preferred, small rituals they'd developed together. Saturday morning pancakes Vivian was actually getting good at. Sunday park afternoons, weeknight dinners where they'd all talk about their days like the family they'd become. Vivian still ran Sterling Tech with brilliance but left at reasonable hours, delegated more, stopped apologizing for prioritizing personal life. Raymond had been promoted with a salary reflecting his actual value. They were building something that worked. One Saturday morning in October, exactly 1 year later, Raymond woke to find Vivian sitting by the window with her coffee, looking out at the city with contentment he'd come to know well. Morning light painted her in golds and soft shadows, and she looked more beautiful than any photograph could capture because this beauty came from being genuinely, completely at peace. He got out of bed, moved to stand behind her, wrapped his arms around her shoulders while she leaned back into him. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly. "Just about how different everything is from a year ago," she said. "How lost I was. How I didn't even realize how lonely I'd become until I found you." Raymond kissed the top of her head. "You found yourself first. I just happened to be there when you were ready to be seen." Vivian turned in his arms, looked up at him with eyes that still sometimes held shadows but were mostly just full of light now. "Can I ask you something?" she said, echoing words from so many months ago. "Always," he replied, also echoing. She smiled, remembering, then asked the question that had started everything. "Am I pretty?" But this time it was different. Asked not from fear or desperation or need for validation, but because she already knew the answer. Because she'd learned to see herself through the lens of people who loved her, because she'd become comfortable in her own skin, in a way that had nothing to do with magazine covers or performance. She was asking because she wanted to hear him say it, not because she needed convincing. Raymond cupped her face in his hands, looked at her with all the love he'd learned to feel again after thinking that part of him had died with Sarah. "You're beautiful," he said softly with complete sincerity. "Not because of how you look, though you're stunning, but because of who you are. Because you're brave enough to be vulnerable. Because you read dragon books and make terrible pancakes and laugh at yourself when things don't go perfectly. Because you chose to stop performing and start living. Because you're here in this apartment being part of a life that's ordinary and messy and real. That's what makes you beautiful, Vivian. You always were, but now you know it too." She kissed him, and it tasted like coffee and contentment and the specific flavor of happiness that comes from being completely known and loved anyway. From Hazel's room came the sound of her stirring, beginning of another Saturday morning filled with pancakes and laughter and small moments that added up to everything. Vivian pulled back, smiled at Raymond with pure joy. "Ready for pancake duty?" she asked. "Always," he replied. They moved to the kitchen together, started the familiar routine that had become theirs, and Raymond thought about that folder of photographs. Just me. Those images of a woman alone trying to remember she existed beyond her empire. But she wasn't alone anymore. None of them were. They were a family built from grief and loneliness, and the courage to ask hard questions, and the grace to answer honestly. 3 people who'd been broken in different ways, learning to be whole together, and that was more beautiful than any photograph could ever capture.